It's truly a historic election year. And we're not just talking about the events that we've seen here in the U.S. Whether you look at President Trump, who is the first candidate that's been convicted of a crime, or if you look at President Biden, who backed out of the race so close to Election Day. If Kamala Harris does win, she'll be the first multiracial female president. Oh, and we cannot forget also the two failed assassination attempts against President Trump. But when you look at this year from a global perspective, we're looking at over 50% of the global population in 60 different countries that have headed to the polls or are going to head to the polls to pick new leadership. And we've seen some upsets already, whether you look at what's happened in France or in the UK. In this white paper, in this video, what we want to do is kind of outline what history has told us about presidential elections. There's a lot of questions that are being asked about who's better, which party's better for the equity markets or the economy. We're going to detail that by looking at some history. We're also going to try and ease some of the anxiety that tends to surround presidential elections. Not only is the presidency up for grabs with this election, but we're also looking at the House of Representatives with an election in all 435 seats, as well as the seats in the Senate. Now let's just look at some of the early polls. Early polls are showing that there's a very good chance the Republicans will actually regain control of the Senate. The House is a little bit less clear. Right now the House is completely split with about 20 to 25 different seats that are still in a toss-up situation. And when you look at the polls that we've seen thus far for the presidency, it's also very, very close at this time. We're about 4 weeks away, but it's pretty much neck and neck. Now, what we can see is that if you look at this chart, going back in time, and we know that President Biden's not running again, but if you just look at historical favorable ratings, President Biden and President Trump have a very similar negative approval rating, or the lowest approval ratings we've seen of presidencies. And Kamala Harris isn't that far behind. She actually also has less than a 50% favorability rating. So this is going to be a very close election on election night. What does history tell us about not only election years in the economy, but is there a party that's better for the economy? And what we can see is that if you go back to 1930, historically, year 3 and year 4 of a presidential term are the best times for the economy. You can see in this chart that year 3 and year 4 produce the best average GDP, but it's positive 90% in year 4. And some of the times that's because presidents are spending in order to get reelected. And if you look back at history about a party that's better for the economy, it would tell you that Democrats have a better track record for GDP. But it can be very misleading because not only do presidential terms last 4 years, but the average business cycle is also 4 years. So there's been times that a president comes in when they're coming out of a recession and then benefit from the big growth that you see coming out of that. One thing that is consistent in history is that recessions, if you look at this chart, recessions tend to start the most in year 1 of a presidential term. Going back to 1929, 60% of the U.S. recessions have started in the first year of a presidential term. So this is one of the reasons why we're a little concerned about economic growth in 2025. We realize with this highly divisive political environment and all of the uncertainties, not only here but also around the world, that the elections bring a lot of anxiety for investors. And what we just want to remind you is that regardless of who sits in the White House or who sits in Congress, that over time, if you look in the long run, equities tend to do very well, regardless of who sits in these seats. So we want to just focus on the long run fundamentals from the economy, looking at earnings. Now, when it comes to taxes, and I know that's a lot of concern for investors, keep in mind that we've showed you already that it's a very tight race in Congress and you need congressional approval to make some of these tax changes. So even if you get, let's just say you got a full sweep, a full Democratic sweep, and Harris wants to raise taxes, their seats would be such a fine margin that it's going to be very difficult to get any major tax policy through Congress. This is one of the reasons why we're not jumping to any conclusions. We're not making any massive shifts in portfolios. If there are changes to taxes, we'll look at this on a client-by-client basis. We'll give recommendations on what we think also from your portfolio standpoint and how we would change things if there is a massive shift in the tax policy. It's just something we're not going to do at this point. Now, we'll continue to monitor the situation. When we do get the results on election night, we will look at this. But the one thing we also see is that typically, even though candidates come in with these aggressive policies to get elected, you tend to see that they move towards the middle when they're trying to get those midterm elections. So we're not really that nervous at this point of what's being out there and what's being thrown out there, not only from a tax standpoint, but also from a corporate standpoint. As we said, we'll continue to look at our asset allocation. We'll continue to look at the political situation, but politics is just one factor that we look at when making investment advice. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to your financial advisor. And we invite you to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to our podcast, Markets with Megan. This is done several times a week, and it's a focus on what's going on in the headlines and what it means for your portfolios.